Hello, and welcome to Why Do We Do That, a psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with Dr. John Petrocelli. John is a social psychologist at Wake Forest University who researches a variety of topics within the area of social cognition and decision-making, including the science of bullshit. John gave a popular 2019 TEDx talk entitled Why BS is More Dangerous Than a Lie, that was the precursor for his book titled The Life-Changing Science of Detecting Bullshit. In our discussion, John made the argument that bullshit is one of the most prevalent factors in undermining communication and civil discourse, and after speaking with him, I tend to agree. Humans default to having an opinion on topics, regardless of their knowledge on the topic. And while some forms of bullshit may be harmless, others can have serious consequences. There are multiple psychological mechanisms that contribute to this tendency. But speaking with John gave me hope that we can overcome our apathy about bullshit if we aggressively focus on valuing objective truth over our views and ideologies. We also need to overhaul how we communicate with others to ensure that they will be receptive to changing their views when new information is available. For example, ever since this recording, I've made a concerted effort to start communicating how confident I am when giving my opinion about a topic. Forcing yourself to add the caveat that you're 50% sure of something helps to communicate humility and doubt to others. It also helped me realize just how often I may present uncertain statements as stone-cold facts. I thought our conversation was very enlightening, and that is no bullshit. Enjoy. Okay, today I am here with John Petrocelli. Thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, Ryan.
It was interesting because I was just telling my girlfriend I'm about to hop on with this bullshit researcher, which I'm sure having written a book with bullshit in the title, there's lots of fun sentences that you can say that go along with your book. The title of the book is The Life-Changing Science of Detecting Bullshit. I thought it was super interesting, covered a lot of a very broad range of topics in social psychology, a lot of stuff about misinformation and so on and so forth. I think it's important to start off our conversation by defining bullshit in your how you define it in the book, and in particular how it's different from lying.
Sure. Yeah, I borrow heavily from Harry Frankfurt's original definition of bullshit. He wrote a book in 1986, or I'm sorry, actually an article in 1986 with that title on bullshit, which then later became a book about 19 years later. And the book is actually just word for word the 20-page article that he wrote in 1986. And the way he defined bullshit was that it's a social communicative substance that occurs when someone communicates something with little to no regard for truth or genuine evidence or what we would call established knowledge. And oftentimes, bullshit is confused for lying, and it certainly is not lying. First off, I mean, bullshit is used in the same way, or some of the very same purposes of lying. People use bullshit in a wide range of rhetorical strategies to basically talk about things in which they know little to nothing about in order to exaggerate their abilities, their knowledge, to impress others, to simply fit in with others, to have something to say, to be sort of a factor in the conversation. It's used to influence and persuade other people. And again, just to basically sell the idea that you do know what you're talking about, even when you really don't.
So I think in having had a few conversations about how other people interpret bullshit, one of the things that I've heard is that people react by saying, well, if you don't care about the truth, isn't that lying, right? How do you feel
yeah,
about that?
yeah. So usually bullshitting is confused with lying, but there's an important difference. There's actually a number of differences, but the most important one is that to the extent that the liar is trying to intentionally distort some aspect of the truth, it comes in quite handy to know what the truth is, right? And so,
Right.
so by definition, the liar is usually, if not always, concerned with the truth, whereas the bullshitter doesn't care at all. They're not paying attention to it. They couldn't care in the slightest. And in fact, the bullshitter often believes what it is that they say. The liar does not believe what it is that they communicate. We also know that, to the extent that the liar does know the truth and they're trying to distort some aspect of the truth, then categorically what they're saying is false. But with the case of bullshitting, just by chance or by accident, the bullshitter may say something that's actually correct, but the liar would know whether or not what they're saying is correct. The bullshitter doesn't know. Because again, they're not paying attention to truth, established knowledge, genuine evidence at all. We also know that the social reaction to the two social behaviors is very, very different. So if someone lies to us, usually there's quite a bit of negative reaction. There's a lot of disdain, and there's a lot of truth telling that the liar is going to have to communicate in the future for us to regain their trust and their sense of honesty. There's a huge asymmetry in that. Most often we give people the benefit of the doubt. We think they're nice, they're honest, right? They're trustworthy, but a single lie can change that. And then we need lots and lots of behaviors to regain the trust. But oftentimes with bullshit, people just say, oh, well, Ryan's just bullshitting. And they give you a social pass of acceptance. And they
it's
assume.
wildly
Yes.
unsatisfying
Yeah.
too, especially when
Yes.
you confront. Yeah, I've noticed. Yeah, when you because I think we all have people in our social circle that engage in this behavior, and it is extremely unsatisfying when you see levels of confidence so high that once you finally get a very clear truth, it's, as you just said, it's sloughed off. It wasn't I'm caught. It was just kind of sloughed off, like, oh well, yeah.
Yes. And the problem with that is that most people believe that they can detect bullshit quite readily, and they assume that it doesn't have the negative consequences that lying has. And again, probably because they feel that they can detect it. But studies show that even the most confident people in their abilities to detect bullshit or to detect lies are oftentimes the least competent in doing so. And one of the problems that I believe, and I don't have evidence for this just yet, I'm working on it, so I don't want to give you an example of what it is that I'm ultimately trying to reduce in our communicative culture, but both behaviors both the liar and the bullshitter can actually say the very same thing. And they are similar in that they appear to be concerned with truth. So the liar, if they're telling a good lie and trying to get away with their dishonesty, they're going to oftentimes try to believe the lie, right? They say, lying 101, a trick is to try to imagine that the lie is actually true, and then you'll do all of the nonverbals and intonations in the voice and things like that, and other behaviors that would be consistent with telling the truth, right? But the bullshitter doesn't have those burdens at all. I mean, if you actually believed the lies or the bullshit that you're telling, then you're not burdened with even trying to remember the truth, right? Because you actually believe what it is that you're saying. And they can say, again, they can say the very same things. Like, I mean, if your boss at work says, there's going to be some restructuring, but I can assure you no jobs will be lost during this restructuring. Okay. If the boss is lying, then she knows that what she's saying is not true. She knows that there will be some jobs lost, right? But the bullshitter has no clue as to whether or not there will be jobs added or lost, and really doesn't care. It just feels like the best thing to say at the time, or they know that that's what people want to hear, or maybe they just want to see what it feels like to say that and get reactions. There's many motives to both lying and bullshitting, but I've argued that they're much more plentiful. There's got to be dozens of these situations and context in which people choose to bullshit. And in fact, there was a study done just recently. It's currently under review, where hundreds of people in the workplace in various work sectors were told about the definition, the Harry Frankfurt definition of bullshitting, and asked, well, why did you do this, and what was the situation? And did it work? Were you trying to achieve some sort of goal or objective? And what they found were 36 unique situations just in the workplace, right? That people choose to bullshit. So if the workplace happens to be a place where you would otherwise expect people to rely on evidence-based communication and information sharing, which we would hope, right? We're making important decisions in the workplace and sharing information. You would expect bullshit to be at a minimum. But if there's 36, unique situations, even in the workplace, that we can identify that people would engage in bullshitting behavior, then there must be dozens more in our greater areas of life, even outside of work.
Yeah. As I was going through the book, I couldn't help but think of my former career in sort of working for large companies, and how part of the reason I think why I left is because there's an inauthenticity to participating in that as a career, and it happens in so many different ways. Whether it's talking to coworkers, and that there's something at your company called HR, so you have to watch your language, and that ultimately will lead to a little bit of bullshit when you're talking to them, because you're not going to be entirely honest, and you might say you're not lying, as you said, but you can't be entirely authentic with them. Either that, or if you think about it in terms of the leadership, like you just said, the boss says we don't think there are going to be any layoffs. And even to that point, I'm a little bit more sympathetic when leadership is trying to calm nerves, but they know they can't be honest. But yeah, so is there, in terms of bullshit in the workplace that we're talking about, is there, why do you think it's so common that in the workplace specifically?
Yeah, from my research, I've identified two important factors. I believe there's at least four, but there's two that appear to be the strongest. And I think in the workplace, certainly where you're supposed to have some sort of expertise, the first factor is especially important. So the first factor is just a general implicit sense, a sense or an obligation that you should have an opinion about everything or anything that people are actually talking about, right? Or that other people have expressed an opinion. And so especially in the workplace, where you might have a particular domain of expertise, you should be able to comment or give an informed opinion about the issues under the umbrella of your expertise. So we know, though, that it's just impossible to have a well-informed opinion about everything, right? And everything, when I say everything, quote unquote, is expanding. it's not just, what is your opinion about nuclear energy, and what is your opinion about voting rights and who should vote and when, or what do you think about capital punishment and things like that. It's those things too, but it's also, do you really believe that Slumdog Millionaire should have won so many Oscars, or did Game of Thrones end early, or should Kim Kardashian and her sisters be permitted to digitally modify their pictures on Instagram, and should people be allowed to carry small toy dogs in their purses and things like that? And people will give you readily available opinions, and it doesn't take long to generate an opinion about things. I've even in studies I've conducted, early studies, I've created fictitious diseases well before COVID came along. And if it sounds like it has easy to imagine symptoms, people just throw the gloves down and are able to, they're able to tell you how to prevent the disease, how to treat it, and it doesn't even exist, right?
Right.
You give it a fictitious name that kind of sounds reasonable, and they have ready-made opinions about it. So let's
zoom out a little bit and talk about the culture in the United States, because I feel like it does contribute to normalizing this kind of behavior. I know when I think about what changes I've made personally to try to bullshit a little bit less, part of it is being comfortable saying I don't know. And it seems like such a super basic idea that no one understands, that when you are to assess whether or not you're informed about a topic and be comfortable saying I don't know, the first thing out of your mouth should be I don't know. And it feels like to your point, saying that you have to have an opinion on everything, that's kind of one of the issues with the culture in the United States, probably other first world nations as well, but not being uncomfortable with uncertainty, being uncomfortable with those I don't know statements.
Yes, and I actually hitting on sort of the second strong factor, that sort of underlying when and why people engage in bullshitting behavior, and that is that we have made it so easy to get away with. We accept it. It's very, very rare that someone confronts us with the possibility that they caught us in bullshitting, right? And
that's awkward too. It's super uncomfortable, especially because when someone starts going into their opinion on something, I think a lot of people just say, well, he's talking, so that means he must know something. And then you have this feeling of, well, there's a much larger consequence for me if I think that they're bullshitting, because now I have to go, hey, that's not right. and it makes kind of what they're doing isn't creating an awkward social situation necessarily, but if I say that's wrong, now we've got this bizarre conflict that could happen in pretty innocuous social situations, at a bar, at a family dinner.
Yes. And usually what precedes any increase in the likelihood that someone is going to call another bullshitter on their bullshit is the level of agreement with the claims that are being made. What we've found in our research is it is extremely unlikely that you're going to find someone calling someone on bullshit if they already agree with them. And in fact, when we set up in one study, when we set up our participants to believe, we led them to believe that they were going to communicate their opinions about nuclear energy and other social issues with a sociology professor who happened to have similar attitudes. Right? Again, the gloves were off, and they self-reported significant degrees of bullshit, well beyond another condition that we led to believe that the sociology professor actually had very different attitudes about the three issues that we asked them to report their attitudes about. So the expectations of the audience, if they think that it's easy to get away with, people will tend to bullshit because they don't expect to be confronted, especially with like-minded, similar attitude individuals. And that's what makes it easy to get away with. And a lot of times the reason why we are unable or unwilling to confront others, even though we might know that, okay, maybe that's not entirely true, it's much easier and much more comfortable to focus on everything but the truth and everything but the evidence. It's very difficult to do the opposite, right? So it takes a lot of time and effort to seek the truth, to seek, is there a convergence of opinions on this, coming from independent lines of inquiry that would be a good reason for me to believe something. That takes a lot of time. Again, yeah, you might have the I don't know for 3 or 4 days or a couple of weeks before you have an informed opinion about it. And people just are not willing to do that. It takes a lot of time and effort to engage in evidence-based communication and reasoning. And that's just what most people are not willing to do. I mean, we're cognitive misers. We just do not have 3 days to give an opinion about who we think is going to win the Super Bowl this year.
So in the book, you have lots of interesting real world examples of bullshit. Do you have any favorites in terms of overall? That's the nice little perfect example of bullshit.
Yes, I do have one. Let me ask, can I get permission to cover 4 of them though? Briefly.
Oh, absolutely. We can definitely talk about that.
Yeah. So I have, my favorite has to be the very first in the sort of epigram of the book. So it's a quote by Uncle Rico from the movie Napoleon Dynamite, where he brags about his quarterbacking abilities and his ability to throw a football over a mountain in 1982, and they would have won the state championship if only the coach had put him in the 4th quarter, and if so, he'd be soaking it up with his lover in the hot tub, and with millions of dollars in his mansion, and everything would have been so great, right? Now, that type is probably my favorite because not only is it somewhat humorous, but the only response to that usually is some eye rolling, and maybe a little bit of annoyance. I would say it's relatively harmless bullshit, right?
Right.
Uncle Rico is not going to be drafted by the Dallas Cowboys, okay, and it's not going to change anyone's decision. So my favorite type of bullshit is that which is harmless. And I do think there are sort of 3 general levels of bullshit on sort of a continuum of harm, and some of which actually can have benefits, right? So in the summertime, at the pool, we often tell children, Ryan, they put a compound in the swimming pool water so as to detect the presence of urine, and so as to catch people who pee in the pool,
Right.
And as every kid knows, most kids know that's just not true, because they've tested it. And but to the extent that bullshit, and most parents don't know even if it's true, so but they're going to say it anyway, right?
Right.
To the extent that prevents a few children from peeing in the pool, then I think there's actually some benefits to it, right?
Sure.
But
morally, maybe not.
Yeah,
but some if morally you feel like the ends justify the means, by all means, that's a perfect tactic.
Yes, and there's lots of examples of that. But you also have what I would call bad bullshit. So a good example of that, you might remember from the 2 presidential campaigns ago, our former president at the time said, "Did you see her face? Who would vote for a face like that?" Okay, to me, that is just bad bullshit, right? It degrades and it dehumanizes women. It suggests rather strongly that women can't be good leaders unless
Right.
they're attractive, right? I mean, that just
Right.
does not make sense. And to the extent that that shapes beliefs and it shapes decisions, and there's nothing more fundamental and important to decision making than what you believe to be true, then I think that's quite bad. But you also have directly harmful bullshit. Okay, so if someone tells you, you know what, I can drive while I can text while driving, no problem. It doesn't affect my performance. I can fire off a few texts, and you know what? Everybody does it anyway. I don't really see the problem. Okay,
Mhm.
that is in my estimation is it receives a no, no, no. There is no way that your driving is unaffected while you're being distracted, goofing around on a cell phone. But
Mhm.
people will tell you that, and
Yeah.
to the extent that people feel that it's okay because everybody else does it, which not everybody does it, then I think it has the potential to create direct serious harm. As I would say, it's more than harmful. It's quite dangerous.
Yeah,
So
especially
there's
you see that at I mean, you see it at bars all the time where someone's had a few drinks and it's like, no, I can handle it. And to your point, like it's not something super verifiable. It's not like they're flat out lying. They just, there is an unknown there. I don't know if I can drive home okay, but my goal is to make you go away, and I'm going to use that through these words that I'm
yes.
kind of playing around with to manipulate you.
Yes, yeah, and I strongly believe that like virtually all of our problems, whether they be personal, interpersonal, professional, societal, they're often rooted directly or indirectly in mindless bullshit reasoning and communication that we share. And the reason for that, I
Mhm.
believe, is that people tend to rely primarily on their own personal and professional experience.
Yeah.
From the paper delivery person to the physician. I
Right.
mean, literally, and personal and professional data collection, outside of one's own experience, is an extremely messy data collection method. It results in data that is often random. It's unrepresentative. It's certainly incomplete and inconsistent. It's often indirect. It could be second or third hand, and it's often surprising and counterattitudinal, and not data that we are readily willing to count, in our Excel spreadsheet, if you
Yeah.
will. So it's again, it's a very, very messy way to collect data, and it's not anything like the systematic data collection, that a scientist would use for data collection to make informed opinions about what is and what isn't actually true.
Yeah, I think about the most intelligent people that I know that will heavily weight their personal experience. And I've thought about it a lot, and it is a bit of a conundrum, because it's not that exclusively low intelligence people value personal experience over some sort of objective scientific truth. It's also very intelligent people that do the same thing. And I just released a podcast talking about the self, and it seems to me that one of the processes involved here is self-control, in the sense that I think by default we like these personal examples. We use that experience because
Yes.
it feels very scary to say, no, my default view is not right. This
Mm-hmm.
research study over here, or this data, this body of data, is the truth, not what I'm feeling. And I don't really know, I don't really know what the solution is there.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, you had mentioned it earlier. Well, that the response "I don't know" is often neglected and replaced with basically quick and dirty decision making that sounds good, that leads to some confidence. I mean, I've literally, Ryan, I've asked at least 50 different people who said that nope, I'm not getting a vaccine, I'm not getting a COVID vaccine, I'm not getting a booster. And oftentimes I'll hear things like, well, I've just heard too many stories of blood clots associated with the vaccine. And what I usually do is I ask them, well, so is what you're saying that the vaccine causes blood clots? And I say, yes, that's what I think. I think there's a causal relationship essentially between the vaccine and blood clots. And I say, well, can you just answer me this? Do you actually know what it takes to make a confident causal claim, from like a medical science point of view, as to whether there is a causal connection? What do you compare that to? What do you compare? I said, if you had 1 million people who had the COVID vaccine, and maybe let's say they also had the booster, and let's say 1,000 of them develop blood clots following, shortly after, maybe within a week. So 1 million people vaccinated, 1,000 of them blood clots, right? So that's like 1/10 of 1%. I said, what should we compare that to? Only about 5% of those 50 people that I've asked actually have any clue what we're supposed to compare that to, right? And what we need to do is to randomly select another 1 million people to have maybe a saline shot, placebo, right? Maybe another 1 million people to get nothing at all, right? And then find out, well, what is the base rate frequency of blood clots, and then test whether or not statistically there's a difference between the number of people who get a blood clot following a vaccine versus a placebo without the active ingredient or nothing at all. And then if there's a big difference, then we can say, okay, well, maybe there is a causal connection. But most people are completely unaware. It just feels better, and they feel more confident than to wait for that data and to wait for all of the scientific reasoning that needs to unfold. It's just easier to accept a quick and dirty answer, and then start backing it, and then start finding all kinds of anecdotal evidence to back it up and to feel better about it, and to convince other people that they're right. Because of course, if we can convince otherwise rational and reasonable people that our position is correct, then we gain all the more confidence.
Well, that's the sinister part about public health issues like COVID, because you have. So on one hand, you have people like myself who's desperately trying to just kind of align everything I do with some sort of piece of scientific information. But that is, not only is it exhausting, but in a time where studies are being conducted so rapidly, and you see, I mean, even if you see one contradiction, it's like I literally can't keep up with the scientifically sound, correct thing to be doing. There's that for the people that are the soldiers for reason and science, and then on the other hand, you have everyone else who doubles down on some view. Like it's has nothing to do with, and in fact, I would argue that everyone else, it's not even like, even both sides don't necessarily care about data points. They're kind of going back and forth with a worldview. So it's like something really sinister like COVID. It's like, I don't even know where the non-bullshit solution is. I mean,
yeah, I've argued that the source of bullshit that is most potent is not the people that we may associate most with bullshit, like for social media or even mainstream media. I mean, if Anderson Cooper or Rachel Maddow or Tucker Carlson, if they say something on their programs that I agree with or disagree with, and it may not really have much of an effect. But if my next door neighbor or my best friend or my family member or my Uncle Larry, is also saying the same thing that they are, somebody who I actually respect and somebody who I actually communicate with on a daily basis, and I can ask questions, they're still saying the same thing that Tucker Carlson is, then it's much more difficult to not kind of fall in line and to not be influenced by that source of information. So I'd often believe that and I don't have hardcore boots on the ground evidence for this just yet, but I believe that source, that interpersonal, close, close bullshit is much more potentially harmful and impactful than even things that we get from social media or mainstream media or the internet, because we know, of course, that that those are attention grabbing sources, and there's a lot of misinformation in those sources. But I think there's just as much, if not more, coming from the close people that we interact with on a daily basis that we actually respect and actually care about their attitudes.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated with the amount of, speaking of close friends, close colleagues, I'm always fascinated with the amount of bullshit in human preferences. Specifically, in the book you talk about wine. I love a good amount of BS around food. You have to try this hamburger. It's the best you'll ever have. And we kind of tip back into the kind of innocuous form of BS, but could you talk about some of the examples, some of the research around the BS that goes into our taste preferences and stuff like that?
Yeah, well, most times people believe that they can detect things with their senses and comment on them that just are not accurate. The same thing even goes with their beliefs and their ability to detect lies. People will tell you that, oh yes, I'm a good lie detector, and then you test them, and they may be the very worst bullshit and lie detectors among them. But we know from lots and lots of studies on detecting even differences in wine are more in the imagination than in the actual experience. So if we blindfold wine taste testers, even so-called experts, right, and we tell them, all right, well, I want you to try these two different wines, and you give them two different glasses, but they're from the same bottle, the expectations that they have can color what it is that they experience and what they report. They can take two glasses of wine from the same bottle and rate them very differently and describe them very differently, right? You can also take the blindfold off, right, and say, all right, well, and take a white wine, right, and you pour two glasses of the white wine and you put some red dye that doesn't change the flavor of the white wine at all. So you have an expectation of what's going to be experienced with a white wine versus a red wine, but they're essentially the same wines. You'll also get a different report of experiences and different ratings of again the same two wines. And then you look at a lot of the, especially with wines, I mean, the awards and the gold labels that the bottles get at at award shows and things. I mean, they're just all over the place. There's no systematic way of predicting the success of a wine. And most, if you take a look at the data, and this is very well known, but people don't talk about it. And I think, Ryan, you're probably hitting on one aspect of it. I mean, especially with food and wine, and it's kind of fun, to brag and to get people to share the things that you really like. And again, we feel good about it. And again, to the extent that we can get otherwise rational and reasonable people to agree with us, it feels good, to have consensus. And I think that is part of what can make the behavior of bullshitting a fun experience.
Yeah, and it speaks to, if there's anything that speaks to how commonplace BS is in this category, it's, on occasion I'll say to someone, this, I probably can't tell the difference between two beers, Michelob Ultra, Bud Light. I think I can. I usually say I think I can,
Yeah.
but I probably can't.
Yeah.
And you try to explain that there's some visual cues and it kind of colors your perspective when you taste it, but it sounds like an out of place conversation to say I probably can't tell the difference between two completely different beers. You would get I typically get, strange reactions to that. In fact, people will typically double down and say I'm really good at that, and so on and so forth.
Yes. Well, there's certainly the above average, effect is extremely pervasive, right? So most people believe that maybe they're not, the master of any domain, but they're the jack of all trades, so that they're not master of anything, but they're above average on almost everything, right? And even with ability to detect different wines, or what the best pizza is, or whether or not this automobile, this used car, is going to get you another 100,000 miles, people tend to feel very confident in their predictions. And one of the reasons for that is just basic imagination, and where our confirmation biases tend to take us. So it's very easy to say, well, I think, horse number 7 is going to win this race, and looking at the program of all the horses in the race, this horse has the lightest jockey, and it has the best win percentage, and he's won the most money, and he ran maybe in second place in his last. I mean, if you look at a horse race program, it looks like a bunch of hieroglyphics to some people, right? Because it's just so much information. You could probably figure out what the jockey had for breakfast if you look hard enough, right? But people have enough information. Anything that looks a little bit abnormal or exceptional, people can use that, and it starts driving their confidence, and they start to imagine, oh, their horse winning the race, right? And it's just very easy to then feel confident going into the event that your horse is going to win. And that's why people lose a lot of money at the racetrack.
Now, this makes me think that, the number of domains that we see bullshit occurring, how commonplace it is in conversation. Obviously, there's clearly a strong motive to be perceived as competent. And the more and more I think about it, the more and more I feel like this is just flat out, there had to have been some sort of evolutionary advantage to bullshitting, in the sense that it was less dangerous to express an idea, to have an opinion, or take a stance that, whether or not it's true or not is irrelevant, than to not take a stance at all, or perhaps to be silent. I'm not sure how you think about that in terms of the actual functionality of bullshit in conversation.
Yes, well, it certainly goes well with attempts to persuade and influence people. So we know that if you have strong arguments in favor of what it is that you're trying to sell someone, whether that be a used car, a wine, or some treatment, or the latest diet fad, whatever it is that you're trying to sell them, if you have strong arguments, it is not to your advantage to bullshit. Okay. Because when you have strong arguments and you rely on the evidence, that tends to elicit what we call central route processing, in which people actually think about and they listen carefully to the arguments. And so that's when they can detect the difference between strong and weak arguments. But when it comes to bullshit frames of the same arguments, the very same arguments, and I tell you, well, I don't really care what the research suggests, and I don't care what the experts say. Gosh darn it, this is the best and safest car on the road today, then what we believe is that it tends to elicit what we call peripheral route processing, where people do not listen carefully and think carefully about the arguments. And they're often swayed by peripheral cues, like maybe how many arguments are included in the claim, to support the claims, or how attractive the person is, maybe how tall they are, or how much expertise they have. All of these kind of peripheral cues that tend to drive attitudes in a particular direction. And what we find is that weak arguments, framed with the sound of bullshit, right, as opposed to evidence-based communication, actually performs better than evidence-based weak arguments. Okay, so it is persuasive and influential in particular circumstances, and that's one of the reasons that people use it. But and one of the reasons why it is often effective is that the receivers of bullshit do not ask the right questions. They just simply do not ask, well, who is telling me this? What is their expertise? How do they know that the claim is true? And
Yeah.
what is it that they're trying to tell me? But
yeah, let's stay on this. We'll wrap up by talking about bullshit detection. In the book you talk about the how versus why questions, which is kind of my one of my favorite ways of dealing with bullshit. A couple very poignant questions can really trip someone up when they're kind of just going about some sort of argument, some sort of opinion, really strong opinion that they hold. But what do we need in our bullshit detection kit?
Yeah, I think at probably the best skinny on this issue is to remember three types of questions. And the first one is one that gets a clarification, and that is the what question. What exactly are you saying, Ryan? When you tell me, hey, there will be no jobs lost during the restructuring, are you saying that I have security in my job, that I don't have anything to worry about? Is that what you're saying? Usually what will happen if the person is bullshitting is they will, for the first time, hear what it is that they're saying and actually think more carefully about it. And oftentimes they'll start to clean it up. They'll start to take a couple of steps back and say, well, what I'm actually saying is, for the next 6 months, and so already in that clarification is a great antidote for bullshit. Is to get the person to clarify what the claim actually is, and they'll oftentimes clean it up for us. And so now it's great because now we're already exposing ourselves to a lower concentration, right, of bullshit.
Right.
So that's yes,
because the devil's always in the details, right? I mean,
absolutely,
all types of conversations. It's our default is to kind of express this kind of express our emotional view, not necessarily the components of that view. Yeah.
Yes. And when they're clarifying, they'll tell you, oftentimes the way they clean it up is to tell you all of the factors, if they're just right, if all of the moderators, all of the conditionals are set in this way, under these conditions, this is what I think is going to occur. And then you realize, well, maybe that condition only occurs like 10% of the time. And so it just puts in perspective what the claim actually is. And then the second question to ask is how. And there's actually two good how questions. And the first one, though, is how do you know? How is it that you know that there won't be any jobs lost during the restructuring? And who did you speak with, or how do you what led you to this conclusion? What evidence? And that question is to sort of nudge people to start talking about any genuine evidence that they may have, all right, readily available. But because that doesn't always work the way we want it to, and people often don't include anything counter to that, claim. They don't entertain disconfirming evidence. Another good how question is, how might that claim be wrong, or how might it be false?
Mm-hmm.
And that will directly elicit some entertainment of disconfirming evidence if they've ever entertained it. Oftentimes they'll generate it on the spot if there is any, because chances are they haven't considered it even up to that point. So how the two how questions are pretty good. And then another good question is, have you considered, or what other alternatives have you considered? I hear you saying that no jobs are going to be lost, but have you considered the conditions of the budget and revenue over the past quarter and things like that? Have you considered these other alternatives that are important factors? And all three of these questions, the what, how, and have you considered, they're really basic critical thinking skills 101 questions, and they're all designed to help you better diagnose the speaker's true and genuine concern with truth, genuine evidence, and established knowledge. And then after you get the answer to those kinds of questions, then you can make a determination as to whether or not you're buying what it is that they're selling.
Mm-hmm. And so my last question is going to be, should we call bullshit ever? I know in your book you mentioned that there might be some certain contexts where it would make sense to just literally call bullshit. What might those contexts be, and do you think that that's an effective way of having a conversation with somebody that might be bullshitting?
Yes, I do think that the best context to call bullshit is in private. People want, if they've made claims publicly, okay, that's one thing, but to confront them publicly is going to increase the likelihood that they're going to double and triple down on their bullshit, and then it's just going to make the whole situation worse, right? So if you can do it in private, that is highly recommended. But another good rule to use is to make sure that it is bullshit before you call it, right? And you don't have to use the word bullshit, but you can sort of, I've often recommended just acting a bit confused and start asking those questions. It's just to see, well, I'm really interested. I've never heard that idea. I've never considered that perspective. Before it is, you decide, okay, well, I don't agree. And I think that's wrong. And to be considerate, attack the claim, attack the idea, and not the person. That's a highly recommended rule. And to also permit the bullshitter to do anything other than double down on their bullshit by, for instance, kind of restating their claim, and potentially cleaning it up as perhaps a understandable error in reasoning, and maybe even adding in there, well, I used to think that too, Ryan, that that issue was a problem, and then I had this other information that led me to a different conclusion. And then when we also can admit things like that, we can also, I think, admit our own guilt to bullshitting, and also agreeing not to double down on our own bullshit, which again just makes things worse. And to
Peter Boghossian, I think he calls it a bridge. Like whenever you're talking to someone that might have a wildly different view that may or may not be aligned with scientific evidence, you want to make sure that if you're just assuming that there is sort of a scientifically valid side versus a non-scientifically valid side, one thing you can't do is create a negative emotion in the other person.
Yes.
That's just not that's the last thing that is going to help them revise their position.
Yeah, and otherwise it's also going to just cut, it's just going to cut short the conversation. It's just going to shut it down. But I think the final thing I've got is rule 6 in the book is to not battle bullshit with more bullshit. To be ready to not only have evidence-based information and reasoning and communication in your arsenal, but to explain how you came to the conclusion that you came to, right? And I think we could start to model that for our bullshit artists and our bullshitters that we come into contact with. And don't I would also say, don't expect there to be sort of a change overnight or anything immediate. I mean, it may just plant a seed of how to engage in basic critical thinking and to model that. I think if we agreed to do that collectively, I think we could make a big change in our communicative culture that at the moment holds calling bullshit as neither a descriptive or what we would call a should behavior, like an injunctive norm. It's not a descriptive norm. It's not what people usually do, and it's not what people usually think they should do. Usually they think they should just be quiet and just assume that it has no impact. But my latest studies I'm working on right now with regard to illusory truth show that lies can be tagged. If you tell someone, everything I just told you, Ryan, was a lie, well, then you can tag that as false. You know that it's false. But if I say everything I just told you is bullshit, because by definition it could be, just by chance, by accident, be true, it doesn't have the false tag that's as potent as the one that the lie information. Even if I give you the same information, if I give you an example like Sydney is the capital city of Australia, which that's not true, but I could be lying or I could be bullshitting you. And then if I tell you that it's a lie, then you say, oh, okay, well, now you know that it's not true, right? But I was like, well, I really don't care, it should be, and I'm bullshitting you, then, well, I might be right, right? And it only takes one exposure. That's the crazy thing. It only takes one exposure of an idea to start to think that it's true.
Yeah, it reminds me of how how utterly exhausting it is to not practice bullshit on a regular basis, in the sense that when you really want to be constrained by facts, when you want to be that clear and not misstep and not overspeak, it's just flat out going to be a lot more work. But ultimately, hopefully, that's, you're, as you mentioned, you're modeling a better way of thinking, right?
Yes, I think if people are more willing to do that, there are some benefits to doing it publicly, because then other people may see you do it, and they might think about it for maybe the very first time. They might consider doing it themselves, and then before you know it, you have sort of a snowball effect where people are feeling more comfortable calling bullshit. It certainly happens. I see it happen quite a bit on social media, where people feel somewhat protected and sort of hiding behind maybe their cell phone. But if people could do it in discreet, careful, caring ways, publicly or privately, in person, I think it's much more effective. And you're inviting people to think about things from an evidence-based reasoning standpoint, which I believe is always better. And a better information is not going to guarantee better judgment and decision making, but I think better judgment and decision making almost always requires better information.
Well, the name of the book is The Life-Changing Science of Detecting Bullshit. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much, John Petrocelli, for being on the podcast today.
All right. Thank you, Ryan.
For more on John, check out his book, The Life-Changing Science of Detecting Bullshit. Or head over to YouTube and watch his TEDx talk on bullshit entitled, Why BS is More Dangerous Than a Lie. Be sure to follow the Why Do We Do That Facebook page for updates and additional content. Don't forget to rate and write a review on iTunes. Follow on Instagram at Why Do We Do That Podcast or Twitter at WDWDTpod. As always, feel free to email me at whydowedothatpodcast@gmail.com. This is the final episode of 2021. The holiday break is a perfect time to relax and maybe listen to a new podcast. So please tell a friend about the show if you enjoy what you've heard so far. I'd like to wish all of my listeners a wonderful holiday and a happy new year. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?